Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Adrian Doyle from the British Museum, and he's going to talk about 21st century approach to monitoring for pests using remote monitoring. Over to you, AD.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, assuming this works, you should now be able to see my PowerPoint. So what I want to talk about today is an alternative approach to monitoring for pests. And I'd like to thank colleagues from Insects Limited and colleagues at the British Museum, including the Conservation Department and the Information Services, what some people call IT department. So we're looking at what I call a 21st century approach. For those of you that are familiar with IPM monitoring will be aware that traditionally we use blunder and pheromone monitors, which are placed in collections and non-collections areas. And traditionally, these are collected every 3 months and data is recorded into a spreadsheet. And from then reactions, which might be just business as usual, or alerts can be then added to a system to encourage people to go and investigate. Those of you that know my work also know that I have done a lot of work with David Pinniger and the rest of the committee on what I call collections risks, in particular the color coding of collections from high risk to low risk. A high risk collection would be something which would be category A, or as I am absolutely determined to enter into the IPM records, what I call high munchability. In other words, those collections which are very vulnerable to insect damage, which of course are our greatest concern. But one of the things that has always struck me is that unless we have an active monitoring program where if we know we've got a concern that we do something immediately, that it might be 3 months before we actually find that we've got a problem. And as I said earlier, a lot of monitoring is actually done by a process of putting blunder traps on the floor, perhaps blunder traps on windowsills, or indeed pheromone monitors, either in blunder traps or the kind that we use at the British Museum a lot, which are monitors for Indian meal moth or webbing clothes moth, which can either be put in plastic holders and scattered around the rooms and galleries, but also can be actually put in the base of a blunder trap. But one of the things that I've always been aware of, having worked previously at the Natural History Museum, is those of us that work in very complex estates have very old buildings, and very often, historically, old museums and old heritage sites use natural ventilation to allow air to circulate around the building. But inevitably, these air vents, if you like, or air passages are an opportunity for example, webbing clothes moths to move quite easily around a site and perhaps even get into collection spaces. Looking at the screen that you've got in front of you at the moment, you can see I've just highlighted an example where what we call G60, which is gallery 60, by the elevator or lift near the extinguishers, we've got a catch of 35 webbing clothes moth. Now, as it stands, that particular area isn't a problem, but in actual fact, it is very close to a high-risk collections area, and therefore the alarm bells are ringing. And those of you that know my work, I have actually put conditional formatting in my Excel spreadsheet so that people who input the data can immediately see that there's something that has to be dealt with. But looking at other areas of the museum, and again, not necessarily collections areas, you can see examples that I've highlighted where moth numbers are significantly higher than one would like. And once again, they're not in collection spaces. They tend to be, as the example above, you can see it's in an air conditioning cupboard in one of our galleries. And the one in the middle of the screen shows an example of non-collection spaces, risers, the shop, for example, and another air conditioning cupboard. But how do we monitor these places, bearing in mind that they're actually complex areas to get to? And working with Insects Limited, finding the site trap has been an absolute revolution in using remote monitoring as an opportunity to put monitors out in areas where we have problems accessing or where we have an active concern. The site trap itself, and if you want to speak to Insects Limited as part of the chat, then please feel free to do so. It has a camera, a photographic area, and a pheromone lure actually in the trap itself. These are linked by radio telemetry via the wireless internet system to software, which is either based on a PC or on an app. And the software is very sophisticated. It monitors humidity and temperature from the site trap, but it also has the catch number, and an entomologist in America, where the data is received, will actually identify the insect for us. And this is all presented graphically. You can also put alerts on the system to allow you to say, I'm only interested in an alarm if a monitor shows more than 1 or 2 moths. But for this research project, I put it so that a default option will be 1 moth will be an alert status. There's an example of a screen that we worked on earlier in the year, showing an example of the battery status and lure status, because the software informs you when they are about to be replaced. And as is in common with normal pest trapping, this is every 3 months. You can see the rectangular bar in the middle, which shows temperature and relative humidity. And in this particular case, no insects were actually found at this particular point in time. But also at the bottom of the screen, you can see a video image of the trap looking down from the top and the insects catch along with the bullet lure. And on the right-hand side, you can see other information which you put in, including where the site trap is placed and the history, for example, when you change the lure. We've been experimenting this in a couple of areas. We've been experimenting in the Middle East galleries, our new exhibition on Emperor Nero, which is about to close, some Greek and Roman galleries where we have a historical moth problem, and a secure loan store, which of course I can't show you for security reasons, because loans data is quite, pest data is quite important for loans information. And obviously one of the advantages of this is it can be put in areas which are difficult to access, which require security clearance or whatever, and left. So in this particular case, this site trap is hanging under a showcase in a Greek and Roman gallery. But because it also contains environmental data, it gives us information on the microclimate, which may indicate or may be responsible for insect activity, as opposed to the actual ambient environmental sensor, which might be several meters away in a completely different area and therefore may not reflect the environment that the pest trap is actually in. So one of the things I wanted to say to you, this is an experimental piece of work. It's certainly very advantageous where there are health and safety implications of getting into spaces, no question of that. For remote locations, including off-site storage, I think this has a huge opportunity, perhaps for a new store that's being developed or an area where access is also difficult. For loans, storage and display, I think this is an opportunity that, along with the remote environmental monitors that monitor temperature and humidity, I think this would be a huge advantage. And opportunities for areas where early identifying a catch is crucial, and that might be where, say...
5 minutes, Eddie.
Thank you. That might be areas where you feel that you've had a historical problem, you've perhaps put something, you've made some treatment, or you've undertaken a task, and you want to see whether or not this has been effective. I'm going back to my highly munchable. For highly munchable collections where 1 moth is actually really a concern, I would suggest that this would be an enormous advantage, because then you're getting information at the point at which a moth has been found, rather than, say, 3 months down the line. I've given this a lot of thought, and I think that there are a couple of other things that, as a result of post-treatment, it would be verifying an area that has been effective, particularly an area where perhaps chemical treatments have been used, and you want to know whether or not they've just knocked down the insect population, or whether there's a sort of a lasting legacy, if you like. And again, particularly in areas where access is difficult, security arrangements are complex, or indeed it's a remote site where it's actually, you don't have the resources on site to be able to deal with it. Now, whether or not this could be part of a standard monitoring regime, I'm not there yet. I mean, we're running this project until May next year, but I would certainly suggest that this data can be added to an existing database, And on my Excel spreadsheet, I have created a new type of monitor, which is called ST, which stands for Site Trap. And the data from the Site Trap can be included in our normal IPM data. And finally, one of the things that occurred to me when I was trying out this presentation yesterday was, bearing in mind during lockdown, because of the COVID pandemic, a lot of organisations weren't able to send staff on site, and indeed staff felt uncomfortable about going on site. In hindsight, of course, this would have been a wonderful opportunity to have had some site trap actually installed in the British Museum, including its outstations, where in the height of the pandemic, none of us were expected to travel or indeed be on site. And I think in that respect, something like Site Trap has an enormous implication or opportunities for well beyond the current things that I've been talking about. So just to wrap up, this is an experimental project. I'd like to thank works from colleagues from Insects Limited, Pat Kelly, Ethan and Tom, the British Museum from the Photography and Imaging Department, Information Services. They're the people who look after the IT department and all the faffing around that we've had to do to make sure the Wi-Fi has been connected. Conservation and Collections Care have been absolutely wonderful in helping to support me. The Care and Access Department, who are the people who are responsible for getting to the collection spaces, and Visitor Services, who have been instrumental in supporting us for some of the exhibitions. So thank you very much, and I hope to hear from you in the chat room.
I can see Matt's moving up.
Thank you to the very munchable Eddie there for his presentation. Incredibly well timed. So